The United Nations, regrettably, is part of the distortion of this narrative. We've had some 130 resolutions at the United Nations General Assembly over the last 60 years. All of them address the question only of Palestinian Arab refugees. Not one UN resolution even addressed the issue of the question of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. So this has led to a distorted narrative and appreciation of the Israeli-Arab conflict that the United Nations has contributed to. And in fact, on November 29th, from the last years, in 2007, yet again, there was an International Day of Solidarity sponsored by the United Nations for the Palestinian people. No reference to the fact that there had been Jewish refugees, no reference to the fact that there had been an Arab war against Israel, and a distorted narrative of the Middle East.
The Jewish refugees from Arab countries, are they really refugees? Because they settled in Israel, in other countries.
Well, they are refugees in the sense that they were living in a country from which they were uprooted, displaced, denationalized by law, assets plundered and sequestered. They fit the international law definition of a refugee. Happily, they were absorbed into Israel, and therefore today they do not have the status of a refugee. They have the status of full citizens, which is what the Palestinian refugees should have had in the Arab countries. In other words, the Arab countries bear responsibility for both sets of refugees, Jewish and Palestinian, resulting from a war that they launched by their own acknowledgement to extinguish the nascent Jewish state in 47-48.
What is the responsibility of the Israeli government? As an Israeli citizen, I don't hear Israeli ministers, Israeli governments who are bringing up this question of Jewish refugees from Arab countries.
Well, I think that part of the problem is that the framing of the core issues in the final status talks is part of a selective narrative. In other words, it speaks about Palestinian refugees, but not about Jewish refugees. It speaks about an independent Palestinian state, but does not speak about the legitimacy of a Jewish state in the Middle East. It speaks about settlements, but not about the end to terror and incitement. We need an inclusive approach to final status issues, and that means that this must include reference to Jewish refugees from Arab countries. If we don't, then we have a false framing of the issues, a selective look at the issues, and if you don't address this in an inclusive, comprehensive way, you're not going to have an inclusive, comprehensive, and just solution.
What was the conduct of the Arab member states of the Arab League just prior to the existence or to the independence of the State of Israel?
Well, as it happened, that the Arab League itself had a document which called upon its member Arab countries to, in fact, denationalize Jewish nationals, to, in fact, seize their assets and the like. So there was, in effect, an international collusion by the Arab states to uproot and displace the Jewish nationals. So the Arab League...
Prior to the War of Independence of Israel?
Prior to the War of Independence.
What did they design? What was the planning? Did they draft a law, a plan, a legal plan?
Yes, they drafted laws. We have a report called Justice for Jews from Arab Countries, which documents and details the laws as adopted by the individual Arab countries, as well as the document by the Arab League itself, which sets forth a blueprint for the treatment of Jewish nationals in these Arab countries as enemy nationals, which leads to the forfeiture of their citizenship, which leads to the sequestration of their properties, which even leads to the diversion of Jewish assets for the Arab war against Israel. This is a truth that is not known. It is a truth that needs to be heard. It is something that needs to be addressed within the framework of the understanding of the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict. We need an authentic narrative. We need a joinder of narratives if we're going to have a just and lasting peace in the Middle East.
What is the purpose? Compensations?
No, I think the purpose, as in if you want to really have an authentic peace, the purpose is, and if I can borrow a maxim, that if there's no remembrance, there is no truth. If there's no truth, there is no justice. If there is no justice, there will be no reconciliation. And there will be no reconciliation, there will be no just and lasting peace in the Middle East. So it's not talking about assets as much as it's talking about the importance of remembrance, of truth, of justice. We need to, in fact, have a paradigm which inverts the present paradigm. The present paradigm is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the root of the entire Mideast conflict, if not of Arab rage, that the occupation is the root of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Israeli apartheid is the root cause of the occupation. I think we need to revisit and invert that paradigm, and that is that radical jihadism is the root cause of conflict in the Middle East. In fact, if there were no Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or even no Israel, you'd still have radical jihadism. That the root cause is not the occupation, but the unwillingness in 47 to the present to accept the legitimacy, as distinct from just existence, of a Jewish state, as distinct from just a state called Israel in the Middle East. And that the real apartheid, the real global apartheid, is the unwillingness to accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state in any borders. That has been the historical narrative. That's the historical narrative that needs, at this point, to be exposed, that needs to be addressed, and that needs to be the part of the resolution of the conflict.